Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar on the future of governance in a changing world. I'm delighted to welcome back Devadas Krishnadas, Chief Executive Officer, Future Moves Group, as our guest speaker today. Devadas is an active member of the Chamber and a regular speaker at Chamber events. He's been one of our distinguished speakers, a moderator and speaker at our annual post-budget events, and a panelist on a wide range of other topics. Devadas is one of Singapore's most thoughtful public intellectuals. A former public servant, he is an entrepreneur, a poet, and a published author. He's a frequent commentator on Singapore, much sought after by foreign media to help with their audience's understanding of our country. He is a prolific presence on LinkedIn. Devadas is someone who is not afraid to express his views on political, economic, and social issues, and does so with balance, clarity, insight, and wit. Today, he is going to talk to us about what governance means for businesses, governments, and societies now and in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a thought-provoking and thoughtful presentation and dialogue. Please play your part by typing your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the webinar. I will be back after Devadas's presentation to moderate our dialogue with him. It is now my honor and pleasure to invite our guest speaker to address us. Devadas, over to you.
Thank you, Victor, very much. Good morning, everybody. Let me begin by thanking Victor and his team at the SICC for this opportunity to speak once again with the SICC audience and friends. And today I'm going to be sharing on the concept of future governance, which references a report that was produced by my company called the Future Governance Index, which you can download for free from our website, www.futuremoves.com. And in this presentation, I'll be touching on the more important and salient aspects of the index rather than going through it in its entirety, and specifically emphasizing where the impacts on businesses are concerned. And I welcome your questions at the conclusion of my presentation and the beginning of the moderation. Let me now share my screen. Which I hope you can see. There we go. So the title of this morning's presentation is The Future of Governance in a Changing World. I think none of us will dispute the fact that the world is changing and continues to evolve. And that's largely driven by the impetus of the pandemic, but the effects of the ripple effects of the pandemic are being felt in the technological space, it's being felt in the working space, it's being felt in the social space, and it's being felt in the policy space and the political space. So this is not purely a health crisis or a health event. It actually is a world-shaping event in terms of how we live and how we work and how we govern going forward. So that's my starting proposition. And I'm going to take you through 4 buckets of items. Very quickly, I'll just talk about my company so that you can be orientated to who we are and what we do. And then I'll be taking you through understanding the Future Governance Index, which as I mentioned, you can download from our website. And there's also an interactive page on the website, which allows you to do comparative analysis between the countries. And then we'll be talking about the results and analysis. And here I'm going to be zeroing in on Singapore specifically, although I'm quite happy to talk about the other countries that we analyze. And then we'll be looking at implications and prescriptions predominantly for the private sector. But I welcome a wider range of questions that broaden out the scope of discussion than simply a focus on the private sector should there be interest in that direction. So FMG is a company that I started 10 years ago. We focus primarily in public policy and corporate strategy. And we've done about 300 projects in 20 cities around the world. And we're very fortunate to have worked on many national level projects which have a huge positive policy and social delta, which means that we've been able to bring significant impacts despite being a relatively small company. But we have, like Singapore, we punch above our weight. And one way we do so is through thought leadership. And a very good example of that thought leadership is the Future Governance Index, or FGI. Now, in this FGI, or Future Governance Index, a couple of things that need to be understood quite clearly upfront is that it's a prospective index. It's not a retrospective index. It's not a contemporary index. What we have done is studied 5 major trends which we believe are going to be shaping the 21st century. These are climate change and resource scarcity, technological advancement, aging and urbanizing populations, shocks and crises, and the concept of slowbalization, which is that globalization will continue, but at a slower pace and perhaps with a much more jerky trajectory as we go forward due to geopolitical events, particularly between the United States and China. Now, we've focused on the world's top 65 countries by GDP on a PPP basis, just for the practicality reasons, but also from data sufficiency and availability reasons. So what we've done is created an index, which is the first of its kind, that tries to assess how countries will perform against these 5 major trends under future conditions. Now, naturally, this is not determinative because we have prescriptions within the study which target how countries can deal with their deficits, can deal with their challenges better. And certainly we use the index to advise our clients when they approach us for advice on how they can improve their standing within the ranking. And that's where we go into a tremendous amount of detail where it comes to the specific indicators and measures, which is a technical part of the report, which I won't go into a tremendous detail, but which underlie the robustness of how we've evidence-based our findings. So the purpose of the report is to focus on the future and to also conceptualize the notion of a governance bank. And I'll talk about this a bit more in the next slide. But the concept here is that, first of all, governance is more than government. And I think the pandemic has shown that we have, and climate change in particular has shown that these kinds of challenges which are on scale and have complexity and transcend national borders cannot be dealt with only by governments themselves. We need the participation of industry and we need the participation of societies. And there needs to be a trust triangle between these nodes: government, industry, and societies. So in this concept of a governance bank, we have 3 capital accounts: a political capital account, a social capital account, and an economic capital account. And we take them together, we get the main capital account, which is the governance capital account. Now, there are a couple of observations here, which is that you can make deposits and you can make withdrawals from these accounts through policy action, through community action, and through industry action. And one of the things that the report advocates very strongly is the understanding that you can't wait until a crisis to start making deposits, because it's particularly within the context of a crisis that you're making substantial withdrawals from your political account, withdrawals from your social account, and withdrawals from your economic account in order to be able to cope with the crisis. So thinking in terms of a governance bank means thinking in terms of the long term and thinking in terms of progressive contributions to the political capital in order to build political trust between the government and the people and the industry, contributing significant capital to the social account so that communities have social cohesion and will stand together during a crisis, and contributing significantly into the capital account of the economy so that the economy has the resilience and the strength in order to be able to tolerate tensions and stress during a crisis. And all of these three accounts contribute to the total governance capital account. And when that governance capital account is high, as in the case of, say, Singapore, you're able to weather a crisis much better. We were able to deploy $103 billion of capital through 5 budgets last year. Our social cohesion has stayed intact. The population has been compliant with prescriptive measures, the SMMs that the government has put up. And there's still a tremendous amount of trust in government despite some to and fro and mixed messaging during the course of the pandemic. This is as contrast to several other countries which have not had that level of governance capital. And you see breakdowns in trust between the government and the people. You see a breakdown in trust between the society and economy as capital flight takes place, as industry withdraws from this, has disinvestment, withdraws from the economy, and job losses climb. So I think we are living within a live testimony and experiment which underscores this concept of a governance bank. And we test the governance bank against these 5 megatrends of climate change, resource scarcity, technological advancement, aging and urbanizing population, slowbalization. And when we come to shocks and crises, that's a bit more slippery a concept because it takes in consideration economic shocks, financial shocks, pandemic shocks, and also political shocks. Another very important point that we make in the report is the interdependency between these 5 megatrends. These 5 megatrends will play out over the next 100 years, and each of them has an impact on each other. And what that means is that countries and governments, but countries across the spectrum, industry, people, and the government, cannot afford to focus on a single megatrend. And in certain cases, such as climate change and resource scarcity, as well as potential shocks and crises, which are pan-national, and globalization, which affects global trade, there has to be a multilateral approach to how governance remedies these issues or confronts these issues and overcomes them. National solutions will be necessary but insufficient. Now, this is a slide on the technical nature of how we derived the megatrends. So we have on the left of the screen, the country score. We have the 5 megatrends. And against the 5 megatrends, we have a list of indicators, which total 90. And against the indicators, we have 117 measures. So in other words, for each indicator, there's more than one measure that is used. And these are measures which are publicly available. There are things like absorption of technological adoption, comparative across countries, FDI, measurements of CO2 gases, measurements of financial strength and resilience. These are all then categorized against the data sources, which are validated and itemized within the background of the report, which is for proprietary reasons not available in the report itself, where we use a concept called minimax or min-max normalization to give a score between 1 and 0. 1 being a very high score and 0 being a very low score. What we found as we've gone through the index is that there's a very tight correlation across how countries perform against the 5 megatrends. Now, this is just a flash of the interactive dashboard that you'll be able to access from our website. And on the left, you can see the ranking of the top 24 countries against a particular megatrend. So we have a global score, which takes into consideration all the 5 megatrends. And in this particular case, it's a selection of the performance against aging and urbanizing population. And you can see that Singapore scores at number 2. And then in the middle, you can see a scorecard which measures how a particular country performs against the best performer in that particular megatrend. And at the bottom, you can see how they perform against all 5 megatrends on a relative basis against other countries, which you can make a selection from the cue board on the right of the screen. So these are the top 30 countries by ranking, and Singapore comes number 6. We are the only Asian country in the top 10. And some of you may have questions as to why. And what you can see in this table is also how we perform against the 5 megatrends. We do very well in some, we do well in others, but we have not done, no category in which we've done poorly. And I'll talk you through the individual megatrends as we go through. So in particular, where we did weakest was in relation to climate change and resource scarcity. This is for a number of reasons. So first of all, that Singapore is a very small country. We have a very predominant petrochemical industry. We're the world's 3rd largest petrochemicals and oil refining center. We have, although we have a climate change plan, it's actually relatively unambitious because we have to balance it out against the impact of our petrochemical industries. This is something that may change over time. Certainly from a carbon tax point of view, there's a lot of chatter at the policy level about increasing carbon tax in order to be able to incentivize a more sustainable economy. We have low water security and we have low energy security because in both cases, we are dependent on other countries. But what we do have is an exceptionally stable policy environment, and hopefully this will enable us to be in a position to undertake long-term sustained change, which will move us up the table of rankings over the next 2 decades. We scored ourselves number 1 in technological advancement. This is not a measure of how advanced a country is technologically, but rather is a question about how it's approaching the whole concept of technology. Singapore is fortunate in not having rural areas. We're completely urbanized. We were early on the bandwagon of ICT, and we joined in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And we have a very forward-looking economic strategy which embraces digitalization. An important observation in the Singapore case is we've gone from being a applier of technology to being an adopter of new technology to now increasingly becoming an originator of new technology. And this is not an accident. It's been a result of 2 decades of investment in places like A-Star, in our startup campus, in the creation of the IMDA grants and subsidies frameworks. These are all playing out into results as we speak. And this is also includes the FinTech Sandbox regulatory framework by MAS and the venture capital fund that's been set up by MAS, and also the venture capital fund that has now been announced by Temasek, which will yield results as we go forward over the next decade or so. And so I think we're going to not only be in a strong position we are now at number 1, but we have a very strong potential of staying number 1 because we're placing such a tremendous amount of emphasis on technology. And one part of the reason why we do that is not only for economic competitiveness, but also because of labor force substitution as we age rapidly as a society. So knowing that we are an aging society and we are highly urbanized, as we're practically 100% urbanized, Singapore has done very well to ensure that our built environment is being transformed to adapt to an aging society. We're putting in place healthcare systems and support systems. The Pioneer and Merdeka packages are good examples. Of course, we have the CPF and the MediSave, the 3M system, MediSave, MediShield, MediFund. So the effects of aging will not be possible to reverse. Our TFR in 2020 was at an all-time low of 1.1, and that means we're replacing ourselves at a rate of only 50%. We can do something about it, but it comes at a significant political cost, and this will be through supercharged immigration, to bring in people into Singapore of a young working adult age in order to feed our economic requirements. But we tried this in the early 2000s, and there was considerable political pushback, particularly against the white paper on population, which was issued in 2013. So I think there is still going to be immigration. The pandemic has significantly slowed that phenomena, but gradually as the economy picks up, we will loosen our grip, and if for no other reason, for pure necessity, as we can't afford to starve our economy in order to be able to just please the domestic political situation. The government has a difficult balance of difficult challenge of balancing the tension between the ability of society to absorb newcomers and the needs of the economy to have new entrants as human capital to feed the economy and its growth, particularly in knowledge-based industries. Again here, taking the view of the governance lens, which is multidimensional, this should no longer be seen as a responsibility of the government itself. Society has to be willing to change, and industry has to be willing to work with government to ensure that these new entrants are highly skilled, are well qualified, their qualifications are validated, and that they are brought in and there's skills transfer that occurs between them and Singaporeans who are working in the same companies. And we avoid over-concentration of particular nationalities in each company. I think this is where industrial governance matters, company governance matters. And if that is in place, then the trust triangle between society, government, and industry will become stronger, because this is a particular area where it's weak at this point of time. Now we're placed 9th in terms of dealing with shocks and crises. This is largely because Singapore is a very open economy and has a very small domestic economy. 75% of our economy is trade weighted, only 25% of it is domestic economy. Of that 25%, half of which is actually a contingent economy. In other words, it depends on us having a successful trade weighted economy in order for it to be able to succeed. This is where our supply chain factors come in. On the other hand, as we demonstrated in 2020, we have a tremendous amount of fiscal space, particularly when we consider our past reserves. But it's vital that we don't consider the past reserves as a piggy bank. It's important to see it as a very long run consideration, because 20% of our budget every year now comes from tapping the net income investment returns contribution, or NRIC, which now envelop both Temasek and GIC's long-term returns. And on a long-run basis, what this means is that we're able to increase expenditure through the capital account without raising direct income taxes or corporate taxes. And therefore, it's important that we do not denude these past reserves to a point where the contributions they can make to the capital account every year become more constrained. Because in effect, as with an aging population, our expenditures are actually only going to rise. So our dependency on the NRIC will also only continue to rise. Constitutionally, we're limited to tapping 50% of the long-term returns. We do not now tap 50% of the long-term returns, so there's still headroom to grow, and we have to make sure that that headroom is preserved for as long as is possible. Again, because we are heavily trade-weighted economy, we're very exposed and vulnerable to the notion of slowbalization. We've benefited on the wave of globalization, especially hyper-globalization in the 1990s after the fall of communism and into the early 2000s. We ran into headwinds with the dot-com bubble, with the mini recession in 2005 in the US, particularly with the global financial crisis. And it's important to appreciate that prior to the pandemic, Singapore was already in a secular decline economically. We only had 0.7% real GDP growth in 2019. Of course, we have 7% GDP growth in 2021, but that's off a very low base of a minus 5.8% contraction in 2020. We've projected that we'll have positive growth of 3 to 5% in 2022. At the Future Moves Group, we are a bit more skeptical about whether we can hit this high number, given where we were pre-pandemic, but it's possible that we'll be able to ride a wave of general recovery in the markets of final demand, which are principally in places like China, Western Europe, and the United States and Japan. Now, this particular chart shows a relationship between the score in our FGI, which is on the left, and GDP per capita. And what we can see here, and what this table tells us, is that there's a interrelationship and a mutually reinforcing relationship where you have a high level of governance capital, you tend to have a higher level of GDP per capita. Now, one is not driving the other, they're both driving themselves. This tight correlation, which we tested against with regression analysis, holds true. And what also holds true is the fact that the performance against the 5 megatrends has a tight correlation between about 0.84 to 0.95, which means that when a company and when a country does well against one particular megatrend, it tends to do reasonably well against the other megatrends as well. And of course, this makes intuitive sense because governance capital is not captured within a particular silo. It's distributed, and it speaks about the ability of the entire country to mobilize itself against challenges, both short-term and long-term. So what are the implications and prescriptions? There are 5 major pillars of emphasis that we focus on when we talk about implications and prescriptions. One is the ability to have forward-looking plans rather than continually just be firefighting contemporary problems and challenges. Second, the willingness and ability in fiscal space to make productive infrastructure investments that will pay off over the long term. So if we look at the United States, the $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill that President Biden has signed only last month is the first substantial bill of its kind since the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, which underwrote the development of the federal highway system and the national electrical grid. So the United States is positioning itself largely due to pressure from competition from China to try to transform itself and upgrade its productive infrastructure. It has to do more. It has to upgrade its social infrastructure environment, and it also has to increase its ability to compete from a human capital point of view. So it has multiple challenges, but it's made a tremendous first step, especially given the political gridlock, which is the backdrop for the last 20 years that we've seen at the national and federal level. It's important to have economic diversification. This is to engender economic resilience against shocks. And economic diversification here does not only mean having many sectors into the economy, but also means having many trade partners and many supply chains within the economy as well. And Singapore is a very good example. We, as a small country, have the largest number of free trade agreements, both multilateral and bilateral, in the world. And we continue to expand that, especially in the area now of digital trade. And critically, it's important to have social cohesion. Social cohesion is the foundation for political and economic stability. When you have social cohesion, you have the ability to focus on problems and to be able to harness your people to engage and concentrate on dealing with the challenges that have been identified in the forward-looking plans. And those productive infrastructures will then translate into general uplifts of social welfare. But when you have social disharmony, then you're going to have great difficulty, despite the fact that you may have money available in the fiscal space. People ultimately are the beginning and the end of the story of dealing with future challenges. Finally, an area which we are going to be focusing upon in the last part of my presentation is public-private co-creation and cooperation. And I'll give you some examples of that both nationally and globally. Now, our starting proposition where the private sector is concerned is that we don't agree with Milton Friedman's statement from 1972 that the social responsibility business is to increase its profits. Yes, businesses have an imperative to be profitable, but businesses also are stakeholders in the well-being of the entire country, the region, and globally. And that's particularly so in the issue of a interconnected, interdependent economy, and also complex global challenges like climate change. So as I mentioned, governance goes beyond government. And more than ever now, we need businesses to cooperate with governments and other stakeholders to co-create actionable solutions, because it is beyond the limits of government to be able to innovate and to be able to create broad-based solutions that are able to deal with complex, large-scale challenges. And it's also important for businesses to be part of the solution when we talk about a sustainable economic ecosystem that has the ability to be financially profitable, but also to be as least harmful to the planet as is possible, and taking into consideration the very long-term view on the health of the planet. So one of the things that have been most prominent in the pandemic is the acceleration of digitalization. When I was a young officer in government, I was the secretary to the Interministerial Committee on SARS. For those who remember SARS in 2003, there was no default work from home because there was no technology available for us to be able to do so. There was no broadband, there was no Zoom, there was no Teams, there was no platform technologies. So despite the fact that the fatality, the virulence of SARS was much greater than COVID, we had to continue to go to work in order to keep the economy going. But today, we have digitalization as an option. And digitalization is going to become all pervasive across economy, society, and government. And as PM Lee mentioned at the APEC CEO Summit last month, he talked specifically about all relevant stakeholders need to be involved. And these include government, private sector, and civil society. So he's essentially talking in terms of our concept of a governance bank. That means that we have to make investments in digital technologies, investments in digital skills in the workforce, investments to ensure digital transformation is focused on improving people's lives and not just improving profits, and that there's multilateral coordination on digital governance. And as much as this is an accelerating trend, we're still at the early stages of the discussion on digital governance. And that's something that has to have the participation not only of governments, but also of the large digital platform owners like Amazon and now Meta, Tencent, Alibaba. It's important that we don't end up in a world that's bifurcated between the geopolitics of China and the United States, but that we have a interconnected, interdependent, and relatively free flow of digital technology, goods, and services that can be undertaken on a high trust basis, on a relatively consistent basis of rules and regulations. So innovation needs to drive this robust and inclusive economic growth. Governments can create the enabling conditions, but it's private sector that's going to carry out the innovation and bear the commercial risks. And in some of these areas, particularly vaccine development, it's been the private sector that's actually come to the rescue of the entire globe by developing the vaccines that are necessary for us to be able to develop a degree of immunity, not 100%, but at least immune defense against the COVID variants to date. Will remain to be seen how effective the vaccines are against the Omicron variant, but so far it seems that the vaccines have a degree of efficacy that is encouraging. Now, when we think about climate change, this is an example of from Singapore. This is a sustainable Jurong Island plan that was just announced about 2 months ago. And this is where the private sector, large players are coming together with the government. The government is creating the regulations, it's creating the targets, it's creating the KPI measurement systems, it's creating investment channels for ensuring that it's cost sharing, but it's partnering with the private sector in order to be able to solution and realize this very long-term plan that will take about 20 years to actualize. in progressive building blocks. This is a perfect example of co-creation of solutions to deal with very complex transformations that need to occur in order for us to be able to be in a better position to deal with challenges that are transnational in nature, in this particular case, climate change. Now, during the pandemic, what we also saw was innovation in the way in which international organizations like the WHO came together with private consortiums like Gavi, and also private companies such as the vaccine makers, in order to be able to accelerate the development of vaccines, but also to pay attention to the nitty-gritty operational issues of funding and logistics on a global scale. And this is exactly the kind of international cooperation that we're going to have in order to be able to deal with long-term challenges, such as a potential future pandemic, which even more virulent virus, but also for climate change. And we've just finished COP16 or 26, and we hope that that's going to lead us down a pathway of progressive commitments that are binding on the part of governments and industries to be able to not just raise capital, but change behavior. Here in Singapore, we have 3 examples that I'm just going to quickly take you through. Climate Action Change X, which is our global carbon exchange and marketplace, which the government has enabled and put together in a framework that they've worked together with SGX, DBS, Standard Chartered, and Temasek. The Jurong Island Innovation Challenge, which is an initiative by Enterprise Singapore and JTC, which challenges startups and SMEs to be able to tackle challenges in the areas of energy management, emissions reduction, water management, and waste management. And the Next Generation ERP, which is intended to be able to make more efficient the way in which we manage our road traffic conditions. And of course, we're heading towards a future where through regulatory action, we will be phasing out combustion engine powered vehicles and moving towards hybrid and electric vehicle powered vehicles in the future, and particularly changing the mix towards a bias towards the public transport option as opposed to private transport. So this brings me to the close of my presentation. And I just want to bring your attention to the fact that, again, you can download the report from our website. You can watch our economic trailer, and you can also read companion articles to this particular report that have been released since the FGI was produced in October of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Devadas. That was thoughtful and thought-provoking. I want to start off with a couple of very basic initial questions before we move on to discussing the content that you've just shared. So first of all, perhaps most obviously, why did your firm decide to do this? Did you see that there was a gap in the market that you felt best placed to fill?
I think there are 3 reasons why we decided to do this. Number one is, as a company, one of our strong foundations is being a thought leader. And so we invested in this project in order to be able to contribute to the broader discussion of governance. And we felt that particularly pertinent within the context of the pandemic. So that's the first reason. The second reason is we felt that it's very important to be able to offer a perspective that is prospective rather than retrospective. And we wanted to be able to innovate a way to do that. And that took us about 6 months of research, trial and error, bringing together different indices and working out different techniques, statistical techniques to be able to produce the index that you find in front of you today. The third reason is it's purely a business one. It's in order to be able to showcase our capabilities to the governments and companies out there, and hope that they will come to us for advice and consulting support in order to be able to improve how they can contribute to the governance capital, if they are business or they are society, or as a government, how they can introduce enabling policies and conditions in order to be able to move the metrics in particular measures and indicators in order to be able for them to go up the rankings on a relative basis and then on an absolute basis in future years.
Thank you. And is this something that you intend to do biennially, or is there going to be a regular update?
It's not something we intend to do annually, because we don't expect that these kinds of changes are going to be taking place substantially within a year-on-year basis. So it may be something that we do every 3 years in order to allow enough time to pass for changes to be actually captured by the measures and indicators that we have included in the index. So a 3 to 5 year interval is probably wise when we are taking a prospective approach to looking at these kinds of megatrends.
Yeah, that seems very sensible. I was struck as you were talking us through Singapore scores that for all that it looks good, there are, of course, warning signs lurking in the wings. And even with technological adoption, which I agree has been extraordinary in the last 20 years, we still seem to be very much behind the curve of other developed economies. For example, we still have banks and other financial services firms paying for goods and services by check. And you would think that in a world where we do have a smart nation ambition, that we would have more technology rather than less, on the argument that you gave us, which was, it has to make life easier and better for more users.
Well, I think here you've pinpointed a very important point of tension between the fact that the technology is actually already available in Singapore for digital payments to be made easily between individuals, between businesses, even between individuals and the government. You can make digital payments to your CPF and so on. You can pay for government public services electronically. But then there's a cultural element to it. And that cultural element is what is slowing us down in terms of people still holding on to wanting to pay for checks and so on. And that's linked to us also being an aging society. So if you ask yourself, who are the ones who are using checks to pay? It's actually the older population that are used to that system. They trust it, they understand it. Whereas when it comes to new technologies, it's not something that they are learning, picking up particularly well. It's not something that they're easily comfortable with. So just within the context of my own family, my father still uses checks, but I use all digital payments to facilitate transfers. So there is a generational issue, there's an aging issue that we have to cope with. And it's something that will lead to Singapore continuing to run, to some extent, parallel systems, simply because of the fact that we have this growing aging population. By the time of the next election, 600,000 Singaporeans and PRs are going to be above the age of 65, one in four. So non-trivial and they're going to also be living longer. So this is an opportunity for us to be able to try to educate them as much as possible, to transfer them to the digital economy. And the IMDA has a Silver Digital Ambassadors program that focuses on doing that. But culture is slow to change. People are slow to change. Technology is fast to adopt. So what we will see as we go through this aging curve is that the young generation and the middle-aged generation, who are already rapidly adopting technologies or already adopted technologies, will be living in one kind of universe where the aging population are probably going to be lagging and living, and we're going to have to retain some degree of legacy infrastructure in order for them to be able to function.
Now, I fully understand the points you're making with regard to the end users. But what I don't understand is why banks and other financial services firms are not on board making use of the e-payments that they themselves facilitate for many of their customers. That there seems to be a disconnect. And one other example I would like to share is the whole e-invoicing movement is very slow to get off the ground. Yeah. We did an exercise in the chamber that out of 500 plus companies, only 100 are on PEPL, which is the e-invoicing system. And of that 100, a tiny number, less than 15, actually knew they were on that system in terms of their finance teams. So there seems to be a real disconnect here that is slowing us down and putting brakes on that really we don't need to have.
That's true. And one of the kick in the pants that's going to be coming very soon is the advent of the 5 digital banks that are going to become operational in 2023. These were given licenses. There was a delay due to the pandemic, but I think their advent into the market is going to catalyze legacy banks to ensure that their infrastructure becomes more efficient, because these digital banks are going to be much more cost efficient to operate. They're going to offer new solutions which are entirely digital based, and they're going to attract new customers who are going to be interested in the lower fees, lower costs, greater options, greater flexibility, and also greater mobility of their money and payment systems. And they're also going to be focused on, especially the wholesale banks, they'll be able to do business between B2B. And that's going to also have a transformational effect on our legacy financial infrastructure. So I think that's coming soon. And it's important that our legacy banks mobilize themselves to be as competitive as possible. And I think some of them are, DBS in particular, I think has been doing so. OCBC has been making investments. UOB maybe lagging a little bit as a traditional bank. But our international banks are certainly, I think, going to be able to catch up much more quickly, given that their international sister commercial organizations within the group ecosystem have already embraced digitalization. On the issue of e-invoicing and payments, I think that's something that there's a lack of knowledge in the economy as a whole. Many companies are not even aware of this practical availability. So I think this is where the government and the MAS in particular has to really educate the economy and educate the industry players on the benefits of the system, and also make it easier to access and use as time goes by.
Yeah, and I think that's something for us as a chamber also to focus our energies on in terms of supporting that education outreach in 2022. Before I turn to the questions in the Q&A box, just want to talk about the aging and urbanization component of the index. And as you very eloquently stated, I mean, we really have a challenge in Singapore because our population is aging rapidly. You mentioned the 600,000 of us who will be over 65 at the next election in 2025. And then by the end of the decade, just under 1 million citizens will be over 65. So that's quite a staggering number. And the only solution is immigration.
Yes.
There isn't any other. And yet there is this issue that cropped up in 2011 and cropped up again in terms of people's responses to what has been happening to them during the pandemic. I mean, that's a tough one for increasing the trust to increase the credits in the government bank.
Yes. One of the ironies in the situation is that the greater the proportion of the seniors in the society, the greater the resistance to immigration. Because they are the ones who don't want Singapore to change. And so this is why it's a paradoxical situation. And as we get more aged as a society, the political balance of bargaining power shifts in the direction of the seniors. And so the government will be caught in a dilemma of being in a position of recognizing the reality, unavoidable reality of having to depend on immigration, but yet pander to the political needs and demands of an aging population that are unreceptive to large-scale immigration. So I think there will be immigration, but it will be relatively proportionate more gradual than what we saw in the early 2000s, much more calibrated, focus on quality, and but it will still meet, there will still be a lot of friction. The pandemic has also unfortunately brought out some of the less pleasant sides of Singapore society. It is a societal, sociological observation that in any crisis, people like to blame somebody else. And certainly based on things, social media such as Facebook, you can see that there's been a blowback against expatriates. There's been a raise of issue of the SICC policy in Parliament, very distastefully and very, I think, unfortunately. This shows that as a population when under crisis, we are not immune to looking for others to blame for our problems. I personally have been advocating for better treatment of expatriates, for better understanding of their contributions to our society. I think I was very vocal that particularly when it came to travel restrictions for expatriates, not being able to give them the assurance of being able to return back to Singapore if they chose to leave. And this went on for almost 18, 19 months before the VTLs were introduced, was particularly horrific emotionally and psychologically for them. And I think it had a reputational impact on Singapore and how expatriates viewed Singapore, which was reflected in the fall in our population of 4.1% in 2020 to 2021. And that was the first time the population in Singapore actually fell since 1970. So people voted with their feet and voted with their dollars. And it's important to appreciate the single fundamental truth that expatriates are not taking jobs from Singaporeans. There are just not enough Singaporeans to fill the jobs that are there. And not all Singaporeans have the skills to fill the jobs that are there, especially the frontier economy skills. We want to and have to be a frontier economy. We have no choice but to be economically competitive. And that means that we have to tap a global talent from a global hinterland and not just from our domestic population. Of course, we should do everything possible to maximize the human capital potential of our local population. These things are not mutually exclusive.
No, and I completely agree with the points on the expatriate experience, which is every bit as important for economic reasons and for social cohesion reasons as the lived experience of citizens in Singapore, because we are a small open economy. And I also agree with you that we missed an opportunity as a country to enhance our exceptional quotient by treating all residents of Singapore, particularly where they are economically active and taxpayers, much better in terms of the access to and from this country. But just going back to your first point in response to my question, I'm not altogether sure that it's the elder or the over 65s who worry most about Singapore, wanting it to stay the same, because by definition they have less concern about jobs, whereas it's younger people who, and certainly this would underscore what I've been told and people have said to me this year and last year, it's younger people who really worry, and parents worry for their growing children, that there will be a limit on opportunity. Don't you think that's much more important than the impact of the, over 65s on keeping Singapore the same and being therefore less open to change and immigration?
Well, I think when it comes to this issue, they are almost equally balanced. I think we can't avoid the fact that the bargaining power at the political level is going to be shifting in favor of the seniors. And seniors, of course, would have concerns over their children and their grandchildren. So let's not forget that. And they were a significant factor in how the popular vote shifted by 10% to the opposition in 2011. Primarily because they were concerned over immigration issues and they were concerned over cost of living issues. So we know this from the post-electoral data. So therefore, we cannot discount it. where 2025 and 2030 are concerned. On the basis of the younger population, I think what we have to understand is that there's a bifurcated workforce. There's a workforce that is cosmopolitan, that is competing at the international level, that is working in the MNC environment or the SMC environment that is export focused, which is less concerned about immigration, in fact, welcome immigration because they need the talent to remain competitive. And then we have a large swathe, which is within the domestic economy space that are not exposed to the global economy directly. They are exposed indirectly. We all are indirectly, but who have a kind of bogeyman view of expatriates that put their jobs are potentially at risk of being substituted by cheaper labor. And this is not substantiated really in fact. At least not in most cases, it's not a general phenomena. So I think we have to understand that people have different perspectives based on where they stand. For those who are competing on an international level, they understand the importance of human capital talent. They understand the importance of a cosmopolitan workforce. They understand the importance of free capital flows as well as free human capital flows. For those who do not, these are all frightening prospects and it can be alarming and can be fear-inducing to them. So it's important at the political level for governments to be able to, I think, communicate more effectively to the population that expatriates are not a threat, but they're in fact an accelerant for economic growth. They expand our economic pie. They pay into our fiscal system. They contribute to the cosmopolitanism of Singapore and therefore the color and vibrancy of our society. And they're by and large tolerant and compliant with our laws and regulations. So they are not a problem factor. They are a success factor.
Yeah, fully agree with you. I want to come back to just talking about slowbalization, but we'll do that later after we've just had a look at the Q&A box. So David asks, looking at the implications and prescriptions slide of your presentation, things look tenuous for the US. This will have global ramifications. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's very important not to underestimate the regenerative powers of the United States. It's gone through ups and downs. It was not a situation where from World War II, it was completely ascendant. During the 1970s, in the post-Vietnam era, it experienced very high inflation, very slow growth, social decay in its urban cities. It's come back from there, but it suffered from several decades of neglect of infrastructure. It suffered from political and policy instability, particularly during the Trump years. So these are things that can be remedied and are going to be remedied. It's going to take some time. What really matters is that its approach to dealing with human talent has to remain what it has been for the last 30 to 40 years. If we look at Microsoft, if we look at Twitter, if we look at Google and many other technology companies, you have international talent either at the senior levels or right at the top of these technology companies. And that's because the world, it's had the ability to bring the world's best into its system economically and academically and keep them in the system, incentivize them, reward them, give them huge opportunities. And instead of contributing to prospects in their parent countries, they've contributed to the economic success of the United States. So how it deals with immigration, how it treats human capital talent is going to be a very important consideration alongside the investment it's going to be making in productive infrastructure, physical infrastructure. The human capital infrastructure of the United States is really its success factor more than anything else. And that's a cultural thing, it's a sociological thing, but first and foremost now it's a political thing. And if it becomes a political football where they cannot tell the difference between unskilled, low-skilled immigration from the south of the border and high-skilled, highly educated immigration that's coming from the rest of the world, they are going to disadvantage themselves going forward.
Yeah, and I think the whole issue of migration is something that governance needs to really step up on and about. I mean, if you look at the horrendous scenes and instances of large numbers of people dying in the English Channel as they tried to sail from northern French ports across the English Channel to the UK. I mean, surely the answer is there have to be more legal routes for migration, and those routes will depend on each economy's needs. I mean, you talked very much about the senior or the sort of tech talent to benefit the US, and we've plenty of good examples of that. But also the US needs lots of other labor in order to pick fruit in California and so on and so forth. So, I mean, isn't that the answer, that the world really needs to look at governance around migration and increasing legal routes, so you try to then remove the snakeheads and the people smugglers?
Well, the answer is yes and no. Lee Kuan Yew famously commented that if you don't go calluses on your heart, you bleed to death. It's important to remember that during the 1970s, after the fall of Saigon, Singapore rejected almost all of the Vietnamese boat people that washed up on our shores. There was a small number that we accepted under the conditional promise of the United Nations that they will have them relocated. They were not relocated, and then in the early 1990s, we actually repatriated them back to Vietnam. And the reason that we never accepted the refugees is because we felt that we were never in an economic or social position to be able to absorb large numbers of refugees. So I think each country has to come to terms with its own conditions and its own culture, its own politics, its own ability to economically absorb people who are going to be financially and economically and sociologically dependent for at least a generation before they're able to contribute to society in a meaningful way, economically and sociologically. So different countries and different cultures and have different circumstances. And I think it's important to appreciate that this is a global and international problem that has, at its point of origin, military interventions in Middle East, especially in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Syria, which the Western powers are as responsible for as domestic players have been. But they're not willing to deal with the consequences and the fallout of that in a fair and an efficient way. Germany is an exceptional country under Angela Merkel in that it took in a tremendous number of refugees, but that's led to a political blowback on her and her party. And so she deserves a tremendous amount of credit for Germany being a welcoming and receptive society, especially against the backdrop of its historical nature in World War II and prior to that. But the bigger question here is, when we look at migration, it's actually a comment on governance itself, because people flee to countries where they think they will get a better life.
Absolutely.
And flee away from countries where the governance capital is zero or negative. Otherwise, they would not give up all their possession, leave all their homes, leave their families behind, leave their friends behind, leave their jobs behind. So it is a huge practical comment on the variance between good governance and poor governance. I think, therefore, again, we can see the governance bank being played out in practical terms on a very large scale when it comes to migration.
I mean, Per's got a question related directly to this, and he sort of says, does the governance report take into account how a government governs outside its own borders. So he references foreign aid in Nigeria, and goes on to talk about, Singapore is one of the richest worlds, but we don't take in refugees. And you've mentioned that in your response to my question. Per wants to know, what do you consider is the background to this selfish view? Is it just space and economics? And how do you think that will change in the next decades?
I don't think it will change. I think it's a pragmatic policy. We are a very small country, a very small population, a very small geography. Yes, we are very affluent, but these are hard constraints that we face. And we certainly do not have I think the luxury of being able to host large numbers of refugees who would be parasitic on our system and increase costs, because these costs will have to be borne by a smaller and smaller population base that will be tax-paying because of the fact that we are a rapidly aging society. Mm-hmm. And so there's going to be political resistance to that fact. And of course, as I say, the hard constraints of land, population, and geography. So I don't foresee that we will have any change in our approach towards receptivity of accepting refugees in Singapore.
I think you're absolutely right. Let's just go back to slowbalization for a moment. I mean, the death of globalization has been somewhat overhyped, simply because the world benefits from all the connections and interdependencies that it has built up over the last 70, 80 years. Share us a little bit more about what you mean by slowbalization and why you think that will be a recurring or constant trend that societies, government, and business need to address.
Well, I think here this is where geopolitics and geoeconomics moving in different directions. From a geoeconomic point of view, multinationals, small and medium enterprises, countries in particular, economic leaders in particular, understand the importance of promoting global trade, protecting it, ensuring that it has the potential to expand. And that's certainly what the WTO is focused on trying to do. And the interdependencies and the interconnectedness of the global economy means that globalization is a reality and will continue to be a reality going forward. We have, of course, hiccups now with the supply chain, but that's really nothing to do with globalization particularly. That has to do with a very specific logistical chain problem, which will be solved over time. The geopolitical issues are unfortunately working in the other direction. If we look at the announcement by Didi, the large Chinese ride-hailing business, it has announced that it's delisting in New York and will be listing in Hong Kong. And I think increasingly this will become a phenomena that we will see happen with other Chinese companies, including potentially Alibaba, that have listed in the United States. They will be also under political pressure to relist on the mainland or list in Hong Kong. So what you have is a tension at the geopolitical level to form two economic armed camps, not just military armed camps, but economic armed camps with fiscal and economic strengths, which are competing within a globalized system, but with a multipolar centers of regulatory and standard setting, and each of which has huge internal domestic markets, which the rest of the world cannot ignore. So Singapore, by certain measures, is actually the world's largest investor in China, for instance. Not all the money comes from us. A lot of the money comes through us into China, but our exposure is very great. We are a strategic security alliance partner to the United States, and it is one of our top 3 trading partners. So we are being pulled in 2 different directions. Whereas in the past, our great strength has been that these 2 things have been pulling together, making us stronger and stronger. Pulling us apart makes us makes us feel awkward, it can also make us feel very much at risk of having to choose sides. We don't want to choose sides. We want to choose free trade. We want to choose open trade. And we want to try to encourage dialogue between the United States and China. And we are a trusted partner of both the United States and China. So we play an outsized role geopolitically as a middleman in trying to facilitate a kind of brinkmanship and trying to find some understanding to be arrived at. Unfortunately, on the US side, the only bipartisan agreement at a geopolitical foreign policy level is one which views China as a strategic rival that needs to be contained. So you have AUKUS, you have the Quad, and it's important to note that the Biden administration has not removed any of the tariffs that were introduced by the Trump administration. And on the Chinese side, you have the Made in China 2025, you have the Common Prosperity philosophy, you have the increasing expansion of SOEs, and you have the pressure that the Xi administration is bringing upon its large, successful innovation enterprises to relocate its centers of R&D, its centers of capital accumulation back into the mainland. And these are, in both sides, actions which then mutually mirror each other and reinforce the impression created on both sides that they are not just strategic competitors, but they're strategic rivals. And the next stage is what should be avoided is that they're strategic enemies.
Yeah.
And they actually depend on each other quite substantially. Let me put this into context. During the Cold War, there was trade between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was largely through the sale of wheat and grain to the Soviet Union because they had annual shortfalls in harvests. And it amounted to about $2 billion per year during the 1970s and 1980s. Today, there's $2 billion in trade between China and the United States per day. So the talk of decoupling is also premature and overhyped.
Yes.
But the nature of their relationship is going to, that geo-economic model of pure freedom of movement, pure human capital flows is going to change. And the Chinese are going to introduce barriers to match the United States. It's going to try to bias its own economic agents and companies. It's going to try to have greater agency, not autarky, but agency on the part of its economy. And keep in mind that the Chinese, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative, which has fits and starts, but it's a strategic and long-term imperative for President Xi Jinping, is creating a land link and sea link system, which is intended to try to outflank the Americans in the Indian and the Pacific Oceans and the South China Sea, which historically have been where the Americans have exercised strength, because the American philosophy of strategic projection of power has been sea-based. But the Chinese are cutting through with their high-speed rail, and the Lao to Kunming line has just opened this week.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary that the relationship is fraught, and it's fraught because the US sees that its only response is to try and contain, when in fact that is just not possible. There is every reason why they should continue to compete. After they try to contain, then, as you say, limits the benefits of globalization, and hence the word that you've coined, the Slowbalization effect. Very, very worrying and very much a reality.
Yeah.
How does the governance model and your thinking cover multilateral organizations? For example, the World Trade Organization. And if we turn our minds back 20 years or so, I mean, the US went out of its way to bring China into the WTO. Of course, they had an agenda, which was that China would become more like the West, which was never going to work. But in terms of governance, how do you view these multilateral organizations, which seem currently very weak?
Well, multilateral organizations are only as strong as multilateral participation and support, particularly of the largest players. I think it's really important, to, as you have done, to go backwards in time and look at where we were in the 1990s. Then the school of political realism was thrown into the rubbish heap, and the school of political liberalism was the dominant thought of the time. Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, that all countries and systems would be gradually transformed into liberal democracies, especially if they were brought into the global economic system. And so the United States, from a strategic point of view, welcomed the growth of China as an economy. It saw it as a potential market. It saw it as a potential partner. And it also was motivated by this particular political liberal theory that if it was brought into the global economic system and was made interconnected by treaty, it would gradually transform into a liberal democracy over time. And as would all other countries. This was, of course, a fallacy that they now recognize. And what they also recognize is that they've actually actively facilitated China into becoming a strategic rival and competitor.
Yes.
So there is a degree of sang-froid and regret, but what is past has passed. And the Chinese grabbed the opportunity that was presented in front of them, and they made the most of it. While America, during the period from 2001 to 2021, was distracted by adventures in the Middle East, which cost a total of $3 trillion for them to fight and lose.
Yes, regrettable, and that very regret has now led to the containment policy, which in and of itself is a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength. Just coming back to Singapore, and that nexus of, in the governance bank that you talk about, society, industry, government. Because of our history as an independent republic, the government has had to and has got used to being the heavy lifter. Do you see the sort of involvement of a broader base of citizens and businesses in, for example, the Alliances for Action and in the Singapore Together movement? Do you see these as attempts by the government to bring more people into the conversation and by doing so increase the trust between industry, government, and society? Yes,
I certainly do think that that's going to be a defining characteristic of the 4G leadership. And that's a positive thing. It's a progressive thing. It will lead to greater inefficiencies in some sense, because when they practice a top-down model, they had less consultation, more direct action. This process of collaboration and co-creation will take more time. It will have to consider more aspects and dimensions, but ultimately it means a bigger tent of governance, a more inclusive tent of governance, greater buy-in. And I think that's going to lead to a situation where our governance capital is going to grow. And that's actually a good thing. What needs to happen is to ensure that when they undertake these projects and they follow them, they need to follow through to show that in particular cases where they may not be so comfortable with some of the recommendations, that they're still willing to implement them. That would be the litmus test of whether there's this trust.
Yes, indeed, and that of course is the most difficult thing of all to do. But it is, I think, necessary, and I would agree with you. I think that they are early stirrings of something quite profound to try and, if you like, balance governance by encouraging active participation by citizens, which at the end of the day is the only way governance as a whole can improve.
Yes.
And this is the dilemma. If we look around the world and we can see so many socioeconomic, political movements, disturbances, discontent, the lack of trust in government by the governed simply leads to a societal breakdown, economic dislocation, unrest at its most extreme. And obviously for a city-state, that's something that we want to avoid at all costs. So I'm glad you agree that these are sort of early signs of progress.
Yeah, the irony,
however imperfect they may be.
The paradox for Singapore is that the society is apathetic.
Yes, I was going to mention that. I wanted to ask you, did you really believe that?
I think it's changing. I think the younger population, especially those under 25, are very different from people of my generation. Of course, I'm an exception of my generation. I'm quite vocal. But I think the younger generation below the age of 25, perhaps below the age of 30, are actually not apathetic. They're looking for opportunities to participate. Of course, there's a gross generalization, but I think it's a valid one. And if there are legitimate opportunities, either from their identity as a professional or their identity at a personal level to contribute to the direction of the country, then I think they will stand up and be counted. And I think we need to be able to create more channels for that participation to happen. And we need to give positive recognition to those who have stood up and been counted, and profile them appropriately so that they are role models for others to come forward.
Yes, and of course, one of the other challenges with this kind of approach is that the diversity of voices and opinions and perspectives comes through, and therefore is harder to manage, because as any government knows, you cannot please all of the people all of the time, however much you might like to. Yes,
but a very important point, and I think this is needs reinforcing over and over again. These collaborative platforms or co-creative platforms should not be seen as simply input channels for ideas to go to the government for the government to implement. It has to also be seen as a distribution channel for the burden of responsibility for action to be shared by government, business, and the community. And so accountability and responsibility should also no longer be concentrated on government alone. It has to be burden shared by industry and by society. And that's also a phenomenal change that Singapore has to undergo, and the people have to be able to accept that they are part of the solution, and that we're moving away from the nanny state model that characterized us from the 1970s to the early 2000s.
Indeed. And that's a great thought on which to end this dialogue and conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Devadas. Our congratulations to you and your exceptional team on a very thoughtful index. We hope it will win you plenty of business. It certainly deserves to do so. And I would like to thank everybody for joining us today and wish everybody all the very best for the festive season. And if we don't see you before 2022, all the very best for the new year. So if we can help in any way, you know how to contact us, here to help at sicc.com.sg. We welcome your ideas, suggestions, wish lists for topics, coverage, whether it's new themes you'd like us to focus on, or whether you've got some issues that you'd like us to help you navigate. From me and my team and the wonderful Mr. Devadas Krishnadas, I wish you all a very good day. Thank you very much.